Sarah Mitchell sat quietly at the corner table in the military base cafeteria, her civilian clothes making her blend in with the handful of contractors and visitors who frequented the mess hall. At 52, she carried herself with a calm confidence that spoke of years of discipline. Though most people who glanced her way simply saw a middle-aged woman eating lunch alone, the base was bustling with activity as usual. Young Marines moved through the cafeteria in groups, their voices carrying across the room as they discussed training exercises, weekend plans, and the usual military gossip. Sarah had chosen this particular table because it offered her a clear view of the entire room while keeping her back to the wall. Old habits from 2 decades of military service that she couldn't seem to shake. She had been visiting the base to consult on a new training program. Her security consulting firm specialized in helping military installations improve their protocols. Drawing from her extensive background in special operations, what most people didn't know was that Sarah had spent 20 years as a Navy SEAL, serving in some of the most dangerous missions around the world before retiring 5 years ago. As she ate her sandwich, Sarah noticed a group of 4 Marines at a nearby table. They were young, probably in their early 20s, with the kind of swagger that came from completing basic training and feeling invincible. She recognized the type immediately. She had been mentoring young service members for years, and these 4 reminded her of countless recruits she had worked with over the years. The Marines were being loud, more so than was typical for the usually disciplined environment. One of them, a tall blonde with corporal stripes, kept glancing in Sarah's direction. His name tag read Henderson, and he had the kind of cocky smile that suggested he was used to getting his way. The others in his group, Rodriguez, Thompson, and Baker, seemed to be following his lead, their conversation growing increasingly boisterous. "Look at that lady over there," Henderson said, not bothering to lower his voice, "sitting all alone. Bet she's never seen real military action." Sarah continued eating, her expression neutral. She had learned long ago not to react to every provocation. In her years of service, she had dealt with far worse than a few young Marines showing off for each other, but she could feel their attention focusing on her. And she knew from experience that this kind of situation could escalate quickly if not handled properly. Rodriguez, a stocky Marine with dark eyes, chimed in. "Probably some contractor's wife or something. These civilians don't understand what we go through." Thompson, the youngest of the group, seemed less sure about where this was heading, but he didn't speak up to stop his colleagues. Baker, meanwhile, was grinning and egging Henderson on with nods and encouraging gestures. Sarah had encountered this kind of behavior before, particularly in her early years when she was proving herself in a male-dominated field. The assumption that civilians, especially women, couldn't possibly understand military life was common among some service members. What these Marines didn't realize was that the quiet woman they were targeting had more combat experience than all 4 of them combined. Henderson stood up, his chest puffed out with false bravado. "You know what? I think we should go introduce ourselves. Maybe teach her a little respect for what we do here." And well, the other Marines exchanged glances. Even they seemed to sense that their friend was crossing a line, but none of them had the courage to speak up. Sarah watched the situation developing with the calm assessment of someone who had faced real danger countless times. This wasn't a threat, it was just immature behavior, but she knew it needed to be addressed before it got out of hand. As Henderson approached her table, Sarah set down her sandwich and looked up at him with steady eyes. She had learned over the years that sometimes the best defense was simply to remain calm and let others reveal their true character. "Excuse me, ma'am," Henderson said, his tone dripping with fake politeness. "My friends and I were wondering what brings you to our cafeteria. This is a military facility, you know, not really a place for tourists." Sarah studied him for a moment before responding. "I'm here on business," she said simply, her voice level and professional. "Business?" Henderson laughed, turning back to his friends who had now gathered behind him. "What kind of business could you possibly have here? Are you someone's wife? Sister, maybe?" The assumption that she must be related to a service member, rather than having her own legitimate reason for being there, was exactly the kind of thinking Sarah had spent her career fighting against. But she remained calm, knowing that losing her temper would only make the situation worse. I'm a consultant, she replied. I work with military installations on security protocols. Henderson's expression grew more skeptical. Security? What would you know about military security? Have you ever been shot at? Ever had to make life or death decisions under pressure? The questions hit closer to home than Henderson could have imagined. Sarah had been shot at more times than she could count. She had made decisions under pressure that had saved lives and completed missions that most people would never even hear about. But she also knew that revealing her background right now would only escalate the situation. I have some experience, she said, understating the case considerably. Rodriguez stepped forward, joining Henderson in what was becoming an increasingly uncomfortable confrontation. Experience? Like what? Watching war movies? Lady, we're real Marines. We've been trained to fight and die for our country. We don't need some civilian telling us how to do security. Sarah noticed that other people in the cafeteria were starting to pay attention to the scene. Several tables of Marines and other personnel were watching to see how this would unfold. She also noticed a few senior non-commissioned officers near the food line, who seemed to be evaluating whether they needed to intervene. I'm not here to tell you how to do your jobs, Sarah said calmly. I'm here because your commanding officers requested my expertise on a specific project. Henderson laughed again, but there was less confidence in it now. Your expertise? In what? Making coffee and filing papers? This is the real military. Sweetheart, we deal with real threats and real danger. The condescending tone and the dismissive attitude were nothing new to Sarah. She had faced similar challenges throughout her military career, often from people who couldn't imagine that a woman could be just as capable, just as tough, and just as dedicated as any man. But she had learned to pick her battles wisely. Thompson, the youngest Marine in the group, finally spoke up. Maybe we should just leave her alone, Henderson. She's not bothering anyone. Henderson shot him a sharp look. Are you going soft, Thompson? This is about respect. Respect for what we do and what we've earned. Sarah realized that this had moved beyond simple harassment into something that these young Marines saw as defending their honor and their service. They genuinely believed they were standing up for something important, even though they were completely wrong about who she was and what she had done. Standing up slowly, Sarah faced Henderson directly. At 5 feet 6 inches, she was shorter than the Marine. But there was something in her posture and her steady gaze that gave him pause. Years of commanding respect in the most challenging environments had given her a presence that was hard to ignore. I understand that you're proud of your service, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. And you should be, but making assumptions about people you don't know isn't showing respect for anything. It's just showing ignorance. Henderson's face reddened. He wasn't used to being spoken to that way, especially not by a civilian woman. Ignorance? Lady, you don't know the first thing about military service. You don't know what it's like to put your life on the line for your country. The statement hung in the air, heavy with irony that only Sarah fully understood. She had put her life on the line for her country more times than these Marines had even been deployed. She had served in operations they would never hear about, in places they might never see, doing work that required skills they were still learning. But Sarah also understood something else. These young Marines weren't really angry at her. They were angry at a world that often didn't seem to appreciate their service, at civilians who sometimes took their sacrifices for granted, and at their own uncertainties about whether they were tough enough, brave enough, good enough to live up to the legacy of the Marines who had come before them. You're right, she said quietly. I don't know what it's like to be a Marine. Henderson smiled, thinking he had won some kind of victory. Exactly. So, maybe you should show a little more respect when you're on our base. But I do know what it's like to serve, Sarah continued. And I know that real strength isn't about intimidating people who can't fight back. It's about protecting those who need protection and standing up for what's right. The words seemed to hit Henderson harder than any physical blow could have. For a moment, his confident facade cracked, and Sarah could see the young, uncertain person underneath all the bravado. These weren't bad kids. They were just young and trying to figure out how to be the heroes they wanted to become. Rodriguez, sensing that Henderson was losing ground, stepped forward more aggressively. You think you can just come in here and lecture us? This is our house, our rules. Sarah looked at him with the same calm assessment she had used on countless battlefields when sizing up potential threats. Rodriguez was more volatile than Henderson, more likely to let his emotions override his judgment. But he was also clearly following rather than leading, which meant the situation could still be de-escalated if handled correctly. I'm not trying to lecture anyone, she said. I'm just trying to eat my lunch and do my job, same as you. Baker, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. Your job? What kind of job could you possibly have here that's as important as what we do? The question opened a door that Sarah wasn't sure she wanted to walk through. Revealing her background would certainly end this confrontation, but it would also create new problems. These Marines would feel humiliated, which could lead to resentment or other issues down the line. On the other hand, the situation was clearly escalating, and she could see that the senior NCOs across the room were starting to move in their direction. My job is to help make sure that people like you can do your jobs more effectively and more safely, she said. I work with military installations to improve their security protocols and training programs. Henderson shook his head dismissively. That's just theory. That's not real experience. Have you ever been in combat? Have you ever had to kill someone to protect your unit? The questions were deeply personal, touching on experiences that Sarah rarely discussed even with close friends. The truth was that she had been in combat many times, and yes, she had been forced to take lives in the line of duty. But those weren't experiences she shared lightly, and certainly not in response to a challenge from someone trying to prove a point. Combat isn't something to brag about, she said simply. And it's not something you use to win arguments in a cafeteria. The response seemed to surprise Henderson. He had expected her to back down or get defensive, not to respond with the kind of measured wisdom that usually came from real experience. For a moment, he looked uncertain, as if he was starting to realize that maybe he didn't know as much about this situation as he had thought. But Rodriguez wasn't ready to let it go. Easy words from someone who's never had to prove herself. You sit in your safe office and tell real warriors how to do their jobs. Must be nice to play soldier without any of the risk. Sarah felt a flash of anger for the first time since the confrontation had begun. Not because Rodriguez was challenging her, but because he was trivializing the sacrifices and service of everyone who had ever worn the uniform. His words weren't just an attack on her. They were an insult to every person who had ever served their country with honor. Playing soldier, she repeated, her voice carrying a note of steel that made all 4 Marines pay closer attention. Is that what you think this is about? For the first time since the confrontation had started, Sarah allowed a hint of her true nature to show through her calm exterior. There was something in her eyes, something in the way she held herself, that spoke of real experience and real danger faced and overcome. The Marines couldn't quite put their finger on what had changed, but they all felt it. Henderson, trying to regain control of the situation, stepped closer. Look, lady, I don't know what your problem is, but you need to understand that you're on a military base talking to real Marines. We've earned the right to be here. What have you earned? The question hung in the air as Sarah considered her response. Around them, the cafeteria had grown quieter as more people tuned in to the confrontation. She could see the senior NCOs were definitely moving in their direction now, which meant this situation was about to be resolved one way or another. What Henderson and his friends didn't know was that they were challenging someone who had earned more than they could imagine. Sarah Mitchell hadn't just served in the military. She had served in the most elite special operations unit in the world. She had completed missions that had literally saved lives and prevented international incidents. She had earned decorations for valor that she kept locked in a safe at home because the missions they represented were still classified. But more than that, she had earned the respect of her peers through 20 years of professional excellence, personal courage, and unwavering commitment to the values that the military claimed to represent. She had broken barriers and opened doors for other women in special operations. She had mentored countless young service members, helping them develop into the kind of professionals their country needed them to be. And now, 5 years after her retirement, she was still serving her country by using her hard-won expertise to help improve military readiness and effectiveness. The irony was that her current work was directly designed to help Marines like Henderson, Rodriguez, Thompson, and Baker be better at their jobs and safer in their service. "I've earned the right to be here," she said simply, but there was something in her tone that made all 4 Marines step back slightly. "And I've earned the right to be treated with basic respect." Henderson opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Is there a problem here?" The voice belonged to Gunnery Sergeant Martinez, a 25-year veteran whose presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the cafeteria. At 48, Martinez had the kind of bearing that came from decades of military service and the respect that came from having earned his way up through the ranks. His dark eyes swept over the 4 Marines and then settled on Sarah with a look of recognition. "Gunny Martinez," Henderson said, snapping to attention along with the other 3 Marines. "We were just having a conversation with this civilian about base security." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "A conversation?" From where I was standing, it looked more like 4 Marines surrounding one person. "That doesn't seem like much of a conversation to me." Sarah watched the interaction with interest. She could see that Martinez was carefully assessing the situation, trying to understand what had happened without jumping to conclusions. It was the kind of measured leadership that she had always respected in senior non-commissioned officers. "Ma'am," Martinez said, turning to Sarah, "I apologize if these Marines have been bothering you. Sometimes young soldiers forget their manners when they're trying to impress each other." "It's fine, Gunnery Sergeant," Sarah replied. "We were just having a discussion about military service and civilian contractors." Martinez studied her face for a moment, and Sarah could see recognition dawning in his eyes. She wasn't surprised. Senior NCOs like Martinez made it their business to know who was coming and going on their base, especially when it involved security consultants. "Miss Mitchell, isn't it?" Martinez said. "You're here working on the new training protocols with Colonel Peterson." Henderson's eyes widened slightly. The fact that a gunnery sergeant knew this woman's name and was clearly familiar with her work suggested that maybe they had made a mistake in their assumptions about who she was. "That's right," Sarah confirmed. "I was just finishing lunch before my afternoon meetings." Martinez nodded, then turned back to the 4 Marines. "Gentlemen, I think you might want to know a little more about Miss Mitchell before you continue this conversation." Rodriguez, still defiant, spoke up. "With all due respect, Gunny, we were just explaining to this lady what it means to serve in the real military. Some civilians don't understand the sacrifices we make." The statement made Martinez's jaw tighten. He had spent enough time around Sarah over the past few days to know exactly how wrong Rodriguez was, but he also recognized this as a teaching moment for the young Marines under his command. "Is that so?" Martinez said, his voice carrying the kind of dangerous calm that experienced NCOs used when they were about to deliver a lesson that wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon. "And what exactly did you tell Miss Mitchell about military service?" Henderson, sensing that the situation was shifting in ways he didn't understand, tried to maintain his position. "We were explaining that military service requires real sacrifice, real danger, and real commitment. Things that civilians can't understand because they've never experienced them." "I see," Martinez said. "And did Miss Mitchell tell you anything about her own background?" Thompson, who had been the most reluctant participant in the confrontation, spoke up nervously. "She said she was a security consultant." "Gunny." "That's true," Martinez confirmed. "She is a security consultant. One of the best in the business, from what I understand. But that's not all she is." Sarah realized where this was heading and felt a mix of anticipation and concern. She had hoped to avoid making this personal, but it seemed like the situation was moving beyond her control. Baker, confused by the direction of the conversation, asked, "What do you mean, Gunny?" Martinez looked at Sarah, and she could see the question in his eyes. He was asking permission to continue, giving her the choice of whether to reveal her background or handle this differently. Sarah considered her options quickly. These Marines needed to learn something today, and maybe this was the best way to teach them. She gave Martinez a small nod. "What I mean," Martinez said, turning back to the Marines, "is that you 4 have just spent the last 10 minutes lecturing a retired Navy SEAL about military service." The words hit the 4 Marines like a physical blow. Henderson's face went pale. Rodriguez's mouth fell open. Thompson looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, and Baker just stared in shock. Around them, other people in the cafeteria who had been listening to the conversation began to take notice of this new development. "That's impossible," Henderson said weakly. "Women can't be SEALs." "Actually," Martinez said, his voice carrying the authority of someone delivering facts rather than opinions. "Women have been allowed in special operations roles for several years now. But Miss Mitchell here was breaking barriers long before that. She served for 20 years in some of the most classified and dangerous operations this country has ever conducted." Sarah could see the disbelief in the Marines' faces. It wasn't unusual. Even in military circles, people often had trouble believing that a woman could have served in special operations, particularly someone who didn't fit their mental image of what a Navy SEAL should look like. Rodriguez shook his head. "But she doesn't look like... I mean, she's not." "She's not what you expected?" Martinez finished. "Let me tell you something about expectations, Corporal. I've served with a lot of different people over the years, and I've learned that the most dangerous mistake you can make is assuming you know someone's capabilities based on how they look." Henderson, trying to salvage some dignity from the situation, said, "Even if that's true, she should have said something. She let us go on talking without correcting us." Sarah decided it was time to speak for herself. "Why should I have to prove my credentials to eat lunch in peace? Should I carry around my service record and show it to every person who questions my right to be somewhere?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah could see the Marines struggling with the implications. They were beginning to understand that their behavior hadn't just been rude or inappropriate. It had been based on assumptions that revealed their own prejudices and limitations. Martinez stepped in to drive the lesson home. "Let me explain something to you four. Miss Mitchell has more combat experience than all of you combined. She's been shot at, bombed, and has faced dangers that you can't even imagine. She's saved lives, completed missions that prevented international incidents, and has decorations for valor that she can't even talk about because the missions are still classified." Thompson looked stricken. "We had no idea." "Of course you had no idea," Sarah said, but her tone was gentler now. "And that's exactly the point. You made assumptions about what a military veteran should look like, how they should act, and what they should have to prove to earn your respect." Rodriguez, his earlier bravado completely gone, stammered, "Ma'am, we didn't mean any disrespect to your service, but you did mean disrespect to me as a person," Sarah pointed out. "You assumed that because I was a civilian woman eating lunch alone, I was somehow fair game for harassment. You assumed that I couldn't possibly understand military service or have anything valuable to contribute to military operations." Baker finally found his voice. "We're sorry, ma'am. We were wrong." Sarah looked at the four young Marines and saw something she recognized from her own early days in the military. They were genuinely remorseful, not just because they had been caught or embarrassed, but because they were beginning to understand that they had acted against the very values they claimed to represent. "Apology accepted," she said. "But I want you to understand something. This isn't just about me. Every day, people make assumptions about others based on their appearance, their gender, their age, or their background. Those assumptions can lead to missed opportunities, unfair treatment, and real harm." Martinez nodded approvingly. "Miss Mitchell is right. As Marines, you're supposed to be better than that. You're supposed to judge people by their character and their actions, not by how they look or what you assume about them." Henderson, looking thoroughly chastened, said, "Yes, Gunnery Sergeant, we understand." "Do you?" Sarah asked. "Because understanding means more than just apologizing. It means changing how you think and how you act going forward." She looked at each of the four Marines individually, making sure she had their full attention. "You're young, and you're proud of your service. Those are good things, but pride without wisdom can become arrogance, and arrogance can make you weak instead of strong." Thompson nodded earnestly. "What should we do differently?" Sarah considered the question carefully. These Marines had made a mistake, but they were also showing genuine willingness to learn from it. That was something she could work with. First, she said. Remember that respect is something you give to others, not something you demand for yourself. True respect is earned through your actions, not your rank or your uniform. Rodriguez nodded. Yes, ma'am. Second, understand that military service isn't a competition. It's not about proving you're tougher or braver than someone else. It's about being part of something bigger than yourself and working together to achieve important goals. Baker looked confused. But isn't competition good? Doesn't it make us stronger? Competition with yourself to be better than you were yesterday? Absolutely, Sarah replied. Competition with your teammates to see who can perform better in training? Sometimes. But using your service as a weapon to attack or diminish other people? Never. Today, Martinez stepped in to reinforce the point. What, Miss Mitchell is talking about is the difference between being a warrior and being a bully. Warriors protect others and serve something greater than themselves. Bullies use their strength to make themselves feel better by making others feel worse. Henderson, who had been quiet for several minutes, finally spoke up. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Sarah nodded. Go ahead. In all your years of service, did you ever have to deal with people who treated you the way we just did? The question was clearly difficult for him to ask, and Sarah could see that he was genuinely trying to understand the broader implications of what had happened. More often than I would have liked, she admitted. Especially early in my career, when there were even fewer women in special operations than there are today. How did you handle it? Thompson asked. Sarah thought about all the times she had faced doubt, skepticism, harassment, and outright hostility from people who couldn't believe that a woman could do the job she was doing. She remembered the times she had been forced to prove herself over and over again, even to people who should have known better. Sometimes I had to prove myself through my actions, she said. Sometimes I had to stand up for myself directly. And sometimes I had mentors like Gunnery Sergeant Martinez, who helped educate people about what was possible. She paused, looking at the 4 Marines who were hanging on her every word. But the most important thing I learned was that my worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions or assumptions. I knew who I was and what I was capable of. That gave me the strength to keep going even when others doubted me. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. We made you feel like you had to prove yourself all over again, didn't we? You tried to, Sarah acknowledged. But I'm past the point in my life where I feel the need to prove anything to anyone. I know what I've done and what I'm capable of. Your opinions about me say more about you than they do about me. The insight seemed to hit the Marines hard. They were beginning to understand that their behavior hadn't just been unfair to Sarah. It had revealed their own insecurities and limitations. Martinez decided it was time to wrap up this particular lesson. Gentlemen, I think you owe Miss Mitchell more than just an apology. You owe her your thanks. Baker looked confused. Our thanks? That's right, Martinez confirmed. Miss Mitchell is here, working on training protocols that are designed to keep Marines like you alive and effective in combat. She's using her 20 years of experience in special operations to help make you better at your jobs. And she's doing it even though she could be making a lot more money in the private sector. Henderson looked stricken. We were harassing someone who's here to help us? That's exactly what you were doing, Sarah confirmed. But that's not uncommon. People often resist help from unexpected sources, especially when it challenges their preconceptions about who can be an expert or a leader. She stood up from her table, having finished her lunch during the course of the conversation. The question now is, what you're going to do with this experience. Are you going to learn from it and become better Marines? Or are you going to find ways to justify your behavior and repeat the same mistakes with someone else? Thompson spoke first. We're going to learn from it, ma'am. I promise. The other 3 Marines nodded in agreement, and Sarah could see that they meant it. This had been a humbling experience for them, but potentially a valuable one if they took the right lessons from it. Good, she said. Because the military needs leaders who can see potential in everyone, who can work with people from all different backgrounds, and who can put aside their personal biases to focus on the mission. Martinez nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of leadership we're trying to develop in our Marines. Sarah picked up her tray and prepared to leave. If you gentlemen will excuse me, I have a meeting to get to. We're working on some new training scenarios that I think you might find interesting. As she started to walk away, Henderson called out, "Ma'am? Ma'am?" She turned back. "Yes, thank you for not giving up on us. A lot of people would have just written us off as hopeless after what we did." Sarah smiled for the first time since the confrontation had begun. "Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow. Corporal, that's what good leaders do. They help people become better than they thought they could be." As she walked toward the cafeteria exit, Sarah could hear Martinez beginning what was clearly going to be a longer conversation with the 4 Marines about professional behavior, respect, and the true meaning of military service. She was confident that those young men would think twice before making assumptions about people in the future. But as she walked through the corridors toward her afternoon meetings, Sarah also reflected on how this incident fit into the larger patterns she had observed throughout her military career and beyond. Despite all the progress that had been made, there were still people who struggled to see past their own preconceptions about what a warrior, a leader, or an expert should look like. The work she was doing now with military training protocols was partly designed to address exactly these kinds of issues. Not just the tactical and technical aspects of military operations, but the human elements that could make the difference between success and failure, life and death. Tomorrow, she would be presenting her recommendations to a room full of senior officers. Some of them, she knew, still harbored doubts about whether a retired female SEAL could really understand the challenges facing today's military. But she also knew that her track record spoke for itself, and that the best way to change minds was through results, not arguments. As she reached the building where her next meeting was scheduled, Sarah paused to check her reflection in a window. She looked like exactly what she was, a professional consultant going about her business. And that, she realized, was exactly the point. Heroes and experts came in all different packages. And the sooner people learned to look beyond the surface, the better off everyone would be. The following morning, Sarah arrived at the base conference room 30 minutes early for her presentation to the senior staff. She had learned long ago that preparation was the key to success, whether in combat operations or corporate boardrooms. As she set up her materials and tested the audiovisual equipment, she reflected on the previous day's encounter in the cafeteria. Word had apparently spread throughout the base about what had happened. As she had walked to her car the evening before, several Marines and other personnel had approached her with respectful nods and words of appreciation for her service. It was clear that Gunnery Sergeant Martinez had used the incident as a teaching moment that extended far beyond the 4 Marines who had been directly involved. At precisely 0800 hours, senior officers began filing into the conference room. Colonel Peterson, the base commander who had requested Sarah's consultation, entered first, followed by his executive officer, the sergeant major, and the heads of various departments. Sarah noted that there were 12 officers in total, ranging from captains to a brigadier general who was visiting from headquarters. "Good morning, everyone," Colonel Peterson began once everyone was seated. "As you know, we're here to review Miss Mitchell's assessment of our current training protocols and her recommendations for improvements. Miss Mitchell has spent the past 2 weeks observing our operations and analyzing our procedures." He turned to Sarah. "Miss Mitchell, the floor is yours." Sarah stood and moved to the front of the room, her bearing confident and professional. She had given hundreds of briefings during her military career, often to audiences that were initially skeptical of her presence. But she had learned that competence and preparation were the great equalizers. "Thank you, Colonel Peterson," she began. "Over the past 2 weeks, I've had the opportunity to observe your training operations, interview personnel at all levels, and analyze your current protocols against best practices from special operations units around the world." She clicked to her first slide, which showed a detailed breakdown of the base's current training structure. "What I've found is an organization with tremendous potential that's being held back by some outdated assumptions and practices." Major Williams, the head of training operations, leaned forward. "What kind of assumptions?" Sarah had expected this question. Major Williams had been polite but skeptical during her initial interviews, clearly doubting whether an outsider could understand the unique challenges his unit faced. The assumption that traditional hierarchical training methods are always the most effective, Sarah replied. The assumption that technical skills are more important than adaptability and critical thinking, and the assumption that leadership potential can be identified through conventional metrics alone. She clicked to her next slide, which showed comparative data from various military units. What Special Operations has learned over the past 2 decades is that the most effective warriors are often the ones who don't fit traditional molds, the ones who think differently, who bring diverse perspectives, and who can adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Brigadier General Davis, the visiting senior officer, spoke up. That's an interesting theory, Miss Mitchell. But how does it apply to conventional Marines? We're not training special operations personnel here. Sarah had worked with General Davis briefly several years earlier, though she doubted he remembered her from that classified operation. With respect, General, I think that distinction is becoming less and less meaningful. Today's Marines are facing asymmetric threats, complex urban environments, and rapidly evolving technologies. They need the same kind of adaptability and independent thinking that we've always demanded from special operations forces. She moved to her next slide, which showed video footage from recent training exercises. For example, yesterday I observed a squad-level training exercise where the Marines were given a scenario involving civilian evacuations in an urban environment. The prescribed solution worked, but it was inefficient and potentially dangerous. Major Williams looked defensive. Those scenarios are based on established doctrine and lessons learned from real operations. Absolutely, Sarah agreed. And doctrine is important, but what I observed was Marines who were so focused on following the prescribed steps that they missed obvious alternatives that would have been safer and more effective. She clicked to show an aerial view of the training area. In this particular exercise, there was a route through the adjacent building that would have provided better cover and faster evacuation times. But none of the Marines considered it because it wasn't part of the standard procedure. Colonel Peterson studied the display intently. Why didn't they see that option? Because they've been trained to follow procedures rather than to think critically about objectives, Sarah explained. They knew how to execute the plan, but they hadn't been taught to evaluate whether there might be better plans. Captain Rodriguez, the intelligence officer, raised his hand. But isn't there a danger in encouraging too much independent thinking? Military effectiveness depends on unit cohesion and following orders. Sarah nodded appreciatively. That's an excellent question, Captain. And you're absolutely right that unit cohesion and discipline are essential. But there's a difference between blind obedience and intelligent compliance. She clicked to her next slide, which showed a diagram of decision-making processes. In special operations, we learned that the most effective teams are those where every member understands not just what to do, but why they're doing it. When people understand the underlying objectives, they can adapt when circumstances change without losing sight of the mission. The room was quiet as the officers absorbed this concept. Sarah could see that some of them were beginning to understand where she was heading with her recommendations. Let me give you a specific example, she continued, moving to the next slide. 3 years ago, I was part of a hostage rescue operation in Syria. The plan was perfect on paper. But when we arrived on scene, we discovered that the intelligence was 12 hours old, and the situation had changed completely. General Davis leaned forward with interest. He was old enough to remember when such operational details wouldn't have been shared outside of classified briefings, but Sarah had carefully chosen an example that had already been declassified. The traditional approach would have been to abort and wait for new intelligence, Sarah continued. But because every member of the team understood the strategic objectives and had been trained to think adaptively, we were able to modify the plan in real time. We saved all the hostages and completed the mission. Major Williams looked skeptical. That's special operations, though. The skill level and training time available are completely different. Are they? Sarah challenged. Let me show you something. She clicked to a video that showed the 4 Marines from the previous day's cafeteria incident participating in a training exercise. Henderson, Rodriguez, Thompson, and Baker were working as a team to clear a building. And Sarah had specifically requested footage of their performance. These 4 Marines completed this exercise yesterday afternoon, about 6 hours after our conversation in the cafeteria, Sarah explained. Watch how they work together. The video showed the Marines moving through the building with precision and coordination. But more importantly, it showed them communicating effectively, adapting to unexpected obstacles, and supporting each other through challenging moments. Now, Sarah said, pausing the video, these same Marines this morning completed a modified version of the same exercise. But with one key difference. She started a new video. This time, instead of being given specific step-by-step instructions, they were given only the objective and some basic parameters. They had to develop their own plan and adapt it as they went. The second video showed a noticeably different performance. The Marines moved with more confidence, communicated more effectively, and completed the exercise in significantly less time with better results. Colonel Peterson sat back in his chair. What changed? Their understanding of their own capabilities, Sarah replied. Yesterday's conversation in the cafeteria was a wake-up call for them. They realized that they had been operating under assumptions that limited their potential. When they let go of those assumptions, they were able to perform at a much higher level. She moved to her next slide, which showed detailed performance metrics. This is the core of my recommendations. These Marines didn't suddenly become better shooters or faster runners overnight, but they became better thinkers, better problem solvers, and better teammates. Sergeant Major Thompson, the base's senior enlisted advisor, spoke up. How do we scale that kind of change across an entire unit? Sarah smiled. This was exactly the question she had hoped someone would ask. Through a combination of modified training approaches, leadership development, and cultural change, but it starts with recognizing that every Marine has untapped potential that we're not currently accessing. She clicked to her comprehensive recommendations slide. First, we modify existing training exercises to include more open-ended problem-solving scenarios. Instead of always providing detailed procedures, we sometimes provide only objectives and let Marines develop their own approaches. Captain Martinez, the logistics officer, raised a concern. Doesn't that create safety risks? What if they choose dangerous approaches? That's where the second part comes in, Sarah replied. We develop better mentoring and feedback systems. Instead of just evaluating whether Marines followed procedures correctly, we also evaluate their decision-making processes, their adaptability, and their ability to work effectively with diverse teams. She moved to the next slide. Third, we implement leadership development programs that focus on identifying and developing potential in unexpected places. Some of your best future leaders might not be the ones who look or act like traditional leaders. General Davis nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense in theory. But how do we measure success? How do we know if these changes are actually making our Marines more effective? Sarah had prepared extensively for this question. Through a combination of traditional metrics and new assessment methods, we continue to measure marksmanship, physical fitness, and technical proficiency. But we also begin measuring adaptability, critical thinking, and collaborative problem solving. She showed a detailed evaluation framework. For example, instead of just timing how quickly a unit can complete a standard exercise, we also measure how effectively they can modify their approach when given incomplete information or changing conditions. Major Williams studied the framework intently. This is interesting, but it seems like it would require significant changes to how we train our instructors and NCOs. Absolutely, Sarah agreed. And that's actually the most important part of the whole program. We need to develop leaders who can recognize and develop potential in all its forms, not just the forms they're used to seeing. She clicked to a slide showing a proposed instructor development program. This includes training for unconscious bias, techniques for adaptive instruction, and methods for identifying non-traditional indicators of leadership potential. Colonel Peterson leaned forward. Give me a specific example of what you mean by non-traditional indicators. Sarah thought about the 4 Marines from the previous day. Yesterday, I observed a Marine who was initially resistant to authority and seemed disruptive to unit cohesion. Traditional metrics would have flagged him as a problem, but when I looked deeper, I saw someone who was actually thinking independently and questioning approaches that didn't make sense to him. She paused to let that sink in. With proper guidance, that kind of independent thinking could make him an exceptional leader. But if we only look at traditional compliance measures, we might miss that potential entirely. Captain Rodriguez nodded slowly. So you're saying we need to look at behavior in context, not just behavior in isolation? Exactly, Sarah confirmed. And we need to create environments where different types of people can demonstrate their capabilities. Some people perform best in traditional hierarchical structures. Others perform best when given more autonomy and responsibility. Sergeant Major Thompson asked, "How do we handle the cultural resistance?" Some Marines might see these changes as weakening discipline or tradition. Sarah had faced similar resistance throughout her own career. By demonstrating results, and by showing respect for military traditions while adapting methods, this isn't about abandoning discipline or hierarchy. It's about making them more effective by ensuring they're based on competence and results, rather than assumptions. She moved to her final recommendations slide. The goal is to create a culture where every Marine feels valued for their unique contributions, where diverse perspectives are seen as strengths rather than problems, and where leadership is earned through demonstrated competence rather than conformity to traditional expectations. General Davis studied the comprehensive proposal. "Miss Mitchell, this is ambitious. What kind of timeline are we looking at for implementation?" "I recommend a phased approach over 18 months, Sarah replied. "We start with pilot programs in selected units, gather data on effectiveness, and then scale successful approaches across the base." She clicked to show a detailed implementation timeline. The first phase focuses on instructor training and initial program development. The second phase implements pilot training programs with careful measurement and evaluation. The third phase scales successful approaches and continues to refine methods based on results. Colonel Peterson looked around the room at his staff. "Questions? Concerns?" Major Williams raised his hand. "I have to admit, I was skeptical when we first brought in an outside consultant, but what you're proposing makes sense, especially given your background and experience." Sarah appreciated the acknowledgement, but she wanted to address the broader implications. "Major, I want to be clear about something. This isn't about my background or credentials. This is about recognizing that effective military operations require diverse skills and perspectives, and that our training methods need to reflect that reality." Captain Martinez nodded. "That's actually what happened with those 4 Marines yesterday, isn't it? They learned to see past their assumptions about what a military expert should look like." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "And that lesson applies to more than just gender or appearance. It applies to different learning styles, different cultural backgrounds, different ways of processing information and solving problems." Sergeant Major Thompson leaned back in his chair. "You know, we've been talking about wanting our Marines to be more adaptable and innovative, but if we're honest, we haven't always been very adaptable or innovative in how we train them." The comment drew chuckles from around the room, but Sarah could see that it had hit home. These were professional military officers who took their responsibilities seriously, and they were beginning to understand that effective leadership meant being willing to challenge their own assumptions and methods. General Davis stood up, indicating that the formal briefing was concluding. "Miss Mitchell, this is impressive work. I'd like you to develop a detailed implementation plan that we can review with the chain of command." "Thank you, General," Sarah replied. "I'll have a comprehensive proposal ready for your review within 2 weeks." As the officers began to file out of the room, Colonel Peterson approached Sarah. "I have to ask, did yesterday's incident in the cafeteria influence your recommendations at all?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "It reinforced some observations I had already made, but it didn't change the fundamental analysis. The truth is, those 4 Marines demonstrated exactly the kind of potential I'm talking about. They made mistakes based on faulty assumptions, but they also showed the ability to learn, adapt, and grow when given the right guidance." Gunnery Sergeant Martinez mentioned that they performed significantly better in today's training exercises, Peterson noted. "They did," Sarah confirmed, "because they learned something important about themselves and about leadership. They learned that true strength comes from understanding and respecting others, not from trying to diminish them. Peterson nodded thoughtfully. That's a lesson that applies to all of us, isn't it? Yes, sir, Sarah agreed. Whether you're a new Marine trying to prove yourself, a senior officer implementing new programs, or a consultant working with people who might initially doubt your qualifications. As Sarah packed up her materials, she reflected on how the past few days had unfolded. The confrontation in the cafeteria had been unpleasant, but it had also provided a perfect example of the issues she was trying to address. The 4 Marines had learned valuable lessons about assumptions and respect. The senior staff had seen concrete examples of how mindset changes could improve performance, and she had been able to demonstrate the practical applications of her recommendations. Walking out of the building toward her car, Sarah encountered Henderson, Rodriguez, Thompson, and Baker near the parking area. They were clearly waiting for her, and she could see a mixture of nervousness and determination in their faces. "Ma'am," Henderson said as she approached, "we wanted to talk to you before you left." Sarah stopped and gave them her full attention. "What's on your minds?" Thompson stepped forward. "We wanted to thank you for yesterday. Not just for not getting us in trouble, but for teaching us something important." Rodriguez nodded earnestly. "We've been talking about it, and we realized that we weren't just wrong about you. We were wrong about what it means to be a Marine." "How so?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about their perspective. Baker spoke up. "We thought being a Marine was about being tougher than everyone else, about proving we were better than civilians or other services. But you showed us that real Marines are supposed to protect and respect others, not tear them down." Henderson, who had been the ringleader of the previous day's confrontation, looked directly at Sarah. "Ma'am, we heard about your presentation today, and about the new training programs you're recommending. We want you to know that we support them completely, even if they might challenge some of your existing assumptions?" Sarah asked. "Especially then," Thompson replied. "We learned yesterday that our assumptions were holding us back. If we're going to be the best Marines we can be, we need to keep challenging ourselves and keep learning." Sarah felt a surge of pride, not in her own accomplishments, but in these young Marines who had shown the courage to grow and change. That attitude will take you far in your military careers and beyond. The ability to admit when you're wrong and learn from your mistakes is one of the most valuable skills a leader can have. Rodriguez looked thoughtful. "Ma'am, can I ask you something? In all your years of service, what was the most important lesson you learned?" Sarah considered the question carefully. It was the kind of question that deserved a thoughtful answer, especially coming from Marines who had demonstrated their willingness to learn and grow. "The most important lesson I learned," she said finally, "was that true strength isn't about being invincible or always having the right answer. True strength is about being willing to admit when you don't know something, being open to learning from anyone who can teach you, and having the courage to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult." The 4 Marines absorbed this wisdom, and Sarah could see that they understood not just the words, but the deeper meaning behind them. "We'll remember that," Baker promised. As Sarah got into her car and drove away from the base, she reflected on the broader significance of what had happened over the past few days. 4 young Marines had learned important lessons about respect, assumptions, and leadership. A group of senior officers had committed to implementing training programs that would help develop better leaders and more effective units, and she had been reminded once again why she continued to serve her country, even in retirement. The work wasn't always easy, and it didn't always involve the kind of dramatic missions that most people associated with military service, but it was work that mattered. Work that would make a real difference in the lives of the people who served and the communities they protected. 6 months later, Sarah returned to the base to evaluate the progress of the pilot programs she had recommended. The results exceeded even her optimistic projections. Unit cohesion had improved, performance metrics had increased across all areas, and perhaps most importantly, Marines reported higher levels of job satisfaction and sense of purpose. During that visit, she encountered Henderson, Rodriguez, Thompson, and Baker again. They had all been promoted and were now serving as team leaders and mentors for newer Marines. When she asked them about their experiences with the new training programs, their enthusiasm was evident. "It's completely changed how we think about leadership and teamwork," Henderson explained. "We're not just better Marines, we're better people." And that, Sarah realized, was exactly what military service was supposed to accomplish. It wasn't just about creating effective warriors. It was about developing people who could make their communities and their country better through their service, their leadership, and their commitment to values larger than themselves. The encounter in the cafeteria had been just one small incident in the larger story of military evolution and progress, but it had demonstrated something important: that growth and positive change were possible when people were willing to challenge their assumptions, learn from their mistakes, and commit to becoming better versions of themselves. As Sarah drove away from the base that day, she felt confident that the future of military leadership was in good hands, not because the young Marines were perfect, but because they had shown the most important quality any leader could possess: the humility and courage to keep learning and growing, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable that process might be.